Well, with the ongoing global crisis, 84% of Nigerian startups have reported disruptions to their fundraising efforts, with 79% of startups having less than a 6-month buffer and only 6% having a cash runway of 13 to 25 months. Endeavour has released a paper that looks at the effect of this on the local innovation ecosystem and what can be done by government policymakers and the business community to minimize the negative impact felt by Nigerian startups and scale-ups. Joining us now is the CEO of Endeavour Nigeria, Eloho Omame, to discuss how startups can navigate their way through this crisis. Eloho, good to have you join us this morning.
Good morning. Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start by asking, help us understand what high-impact entrepreneurship is and why you believe it is the best tool for economic empowerment in developing markets.
Great, I'm happy to. So as you've alluded to, our work at Endeavour focuses on what we call high-impact entrepreneurs and high-impact scale-ups, defined by a couple of characteristics. The first is really that these are big, large, audacious propositions. The entrepreneurs that are running these businesses want to build large regional, national, international, global businesses. Secondly, these are businesses that are scaling, businesses that can scale. So they fundamentally have business models that underlie them that allow the businesses to scale to achieve the potential that the founders want. As distinct from very many other kinds of entrepreneurship, some of which, for example, might be SMEs or small business entrepreneurship, which of course provides livelihoods and creates jobs, but certainly not at the scale and ambition that high-impact entrepreneurs have.
All right, Eloho, kudos to what Endeavour Nigeria is actually doing, but looking at how things have been in the ecosystem here in Nigeria. First of all, Nigeria have been plagued with not actually lean funding for several of the startups. Now, give us a perspective, panoramic perspective of how does the ecosystem now look with the fact that even before COVID, people were not getting as much funds as other parts of the world. And how are things right now?
Sure. I think, so we've put together this report and we looked at a range of primary and secondary sources for it, of data for it. So in some instances, making reference to existing surveys and existing reported impact from the innovation ecosystem, so the startups and the scale-ups that are active. And that indicates that as at May, so at this point, about 5 months ago now, about 8 in 10 startups were saying that they believed that they had a cash runway ahead of them of 6 months, which of course is quite alarming, right? On the other hand, very few, roughly about 10%, reckon that they had runway of more than 12 months. The implication of that 6 months on, 5 months on, is that, if we were probably to resurvey the ecosystem, we would find that very many people had probably had to pivot their business models very, very significantly, or they had to shut down operations altogether. It's difficult to tell from the outside, with absolute certainty what the impact has been. What I will say is that, I think this concern for the ecosystem and this sentiment that it's important that we understand the strategic value of the ecosystem, and as a business community, as an economy, we channel resources and attention in that direction, is not distinct, frankly, from many other economies, right? And I think the importance of that is underlined, of course, by the fact that these are the businesses that are driving innovation. These are the businesses that will be the job creators of the future. And these are the businesses really that will create that sort of widespread jobs and wealth creation that we're of course all hoping that the economy will ultimately deliver.
And looking at the current situation worldwide, from data gathered, how severe has the pandemic been on startups and scale-ups in Nigeria?
I mean, you mean relative to the rest of the world?
Yes.
I don't know that our situation is significantly different from the rest of the world, in that there are significant impact on the entire ecosystem. I think where we differ is perhaps the fact that we already had less funding, I suppose, than we would have liked to see in the ecosystem. And question mark around whether or not looking forward we're going to continue to see the trend, an upward trend, right? There was an upward trajectory in terms of the volume of funds that were coming into this ecosystem in the last 2-3 years. The numbers are still tiny. The numbers are still in the tens of millions of dollars ultimately in aggregate. but directionally very, very positive. The concern is, what is the impact of this pandemic on that trend, right? But overall, I think sort of the startup community globally, the small business community in general has not fared desperately well through this pandemic, and I don't think that situation is probably any worse in Nigeria than it is in many other economies. The question is, when you have a young, thriving, growing ecosystem, when you have an ecosystem that's on an upward trajectory, what happens to that trend, and what is the impact when globally capital providers are potentially reallocating some of their capital?
All right, Eloho, I have a two-pronged question. Firstly, since you've been speaking about startups and the fact that they're feeling the heat from the pandemic,
yes.
What's the time frame? Do you think they would ever bounce back? And what's the time frame of them bouncing back? That's one. On the other hand, it's not been all doom and gloom.
Yes.
Understanding that, like we've seen globally, the likes of Apple, the likes of Zoom, and quite a lot of startups have actually just multiplied 10x over.
Yes.
Which of the startups in Nigeria have probably benefited from this whole pandemic?
Okay, I'll address the first question first.
Yeah.
So the question around timing, I think that's you're asking me to look into a crystal ball, right? And that's quite a difficult thing to do. What I will say is that the current outlook is that, economic outlook more generally, is that we're in for an economic slump. We're likely, we're in a recession, or we're headed towards a recession officially, and that it's likely to run for another couple of years. And I think that is an economic context that is not necessarily playing out in exactly the same way across a range of different economies. Some of, the catalyst has been the pandemic, but we also have residual issues of oil prices, etc. I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. But I will say that, the general sort of economic environment and potentially the fundraising landscape, could look a little bit different over the next couple of years. That said, the second part of your question alludes to the fact that, which I 100% agree with, by the way, that, in the midst of that, what you will have is not a wholesale, one-directional impact on the entire ecosystem. You will have companies that are benefiting from some of the trends, for example, this sort of digitization that we've seen in the way that we all live, right? You've alluded to Zoom, you've alluded to Apple. I would push back on that a little bit and say they're not startups. But I think, the point is well made. So with regards to who is then benefiting and who has seen a positive impact from this pandemic in Nigeria, as you might imagine, it is those startups that have allowed us to make this transition and this shift to digital much more comfortably. So, for example, quite a lot of strong performance coming out of some of the fintech companies, depending on within the fintech landscape where they play. We've also seen education technology startups as well, who have had quite a bit of quite strong tailwinds from this pandemic as well. So I think if you look for trends around where people have had to shift to a much more digital mode of living, right, the kinds of companies that have benefited from that environment have been the startups that have enabled that to happen much more quickly.
And Eloho, at Endeavor, what criteria do you use in selecting and also supporting the, quote, best companies scale-ups in Nigeria?
Sure. So our selection criteria really focuses on three dimensions. The first is the entrepreneur. So we're a mission-driven organization that believe very strongly in this concept of entrepreneur-led economic development. And in order for that to happen, you need entrepreneurial leaders. So you need entrepreneurs that see their role in their ecosystem as, first of all, to scale their companies. And that's the most important thing. To scale their companies, to create these jobs, to help to sort of drive this widespread job creation that we hope that they will achieve. They have these global ambitions, etc., as I've already alluded to. But secondly, they also have a mindset around giving back to their ecosystems. So finding those scalable, transformational business models and then sharing their experiences through mentoring, for example, sharing their capital when they create their own wealth through investing in other startups. And we find that that's sort of, that's a pretty important piece. The second thing is around the business and the scalability of the business. It's important that we have businesses that are proving that they can scale, but that their underlying businesses and the underlying economics of the businesses also can be scaled. It's not, I think you're probably familiar with the data. I think everyone is at this point that, in any startup ecosystem over a 10-year period, 9.5 out of 10 startups will actually ultimately not survive beyond about 10 years. And so what we're looking for is those companies that will survive into the long term, will be, we say, $100 million revenue generators, right? Then the third dimension from our selection criteria is what we call timing and inflection points. So we want to sort of catch companies and find companies at the inflection points for scale, which typically mean that they come into a network like Endeavor, which is a very global network. We have, programs and products and services and mentors to support.
Eloho, permit me to interject at this point. We would actually go on a break. When we come back, we'll still be sharing your thoughts about the ecosystem here in Nigeria and its impact on COVID-19.
Thank you.
Glad to have you back and watching the morning show. And we still have with us the CEO of Endeavor Nigeria, Eloho Omame. And before the break, you were explaining to us what the selection and supporting companies, the way you've been able to select and support companies in Nigeria.
Sure. And I was saying, if you remember that, really for us, there's three criteria. The first being the entrepreneurs themselves and their entrepreneurial leadership, their roles and their ambitions as entrepreneurial leaders within their ecosystem. Secondly, the businesses themselves, the business model, the scalability of the business. And the third, I talked about timing and inflection points and really selecting companies that are at what we call the scale-up phase. So businesses that have successfully navigated that early startup phase, they have solid business models, they're starting to scale rapidly. We usually find that that is about $3 million or so of revenue equivalent in Nigeria. With regards to the support, today we have 10 companies within our portfolio, 17 entrepreneurs, and they sort of, of course, fit that selection criteria, and they've gone through our selection process to join the Endeavor network. By joining the Endeavor network, they have access to a global network that spans 38 markets, and there's about 4,000 global business leaders that then support them or are available to support them as mentors. We also, through a range of programs and partnerships, help them to scale their companies across their needs, their access to talent needs, access to talent, access to capital, access to new markets, and I've referenced already access to mentors. So the form and the shape of that support varies depending on the company. We always try and sort of tailor our activities and our support model for each company depending on its individual stage, its individual priorities, its individual growth plans. But it can range everything from supporting a business that is trying to expand into one of our 37 other markets. The couple of Nigerian companies that have been, Nigerian scale-ups that have been quite public. For example, Migo has spoken about its expansion into Brazil. Paga has spoken about its desire to expand into Mexico. Those are both companies that are within our network today and that we're supporting in both of those efforts. So, the support really does vary depending on the individual entrepreneur. Sometimes it is helping them with their talent needs. We don't recruit on behalf of entrepreneurs, but we certainly provide strategic advice, strategic access to helping them resolve some of their talent needs. And we find that these companies typically, because they're operating at the frontier of their ecosystems, they have gotten to a point where, because we're, as Endeavor, we're usually in ecosystems that are relatively early in their journeys, they find that they have hit the frontiers of those ecosystems in terms of its ability to support them, for example, with talent, or to support them sometimes with the mentorship around the business models. And so the benefit of having this global model and this global access means that we're able to pull across different markets, different levels of expertise, different capabilities, different domain expertise to support the entrepreneurs so they continue to push the boundaries of the ecosystem here in Nigeria.
All right, Eloho, since you're a woman, permit me to actually phrase this question this way. Some people see women in business, especially in the startup ecosystem, as endangered species that should be heavily encouraged. Some say it should be a level playing field. Now, looking at it, answer that particular question first, and how has it impacted more? Have we seen more impact on women, talking about this whole domino crumbling because of COVID-19? Has it impacted women more, or it's cut across the plane?
Well, I mean, I would say that when we look at the landscape of female entrepreneurship, at least with regards to the community that we're focused on, which is startups and scale-ups, it leaves very much to be desired, right? I think for multiple reasons, and it's something that I feel personally quite passionate about, but for multiple reasons. I think if you look at the data, I think 2019, the data suggests that something like 13% or so of capital that came into the ecosystem went to female-led startups. If you look globally, that number is actually quite encouraging in that globally the number is much lower. So Africa and Nigeria seems to be doing much better in that regard. That said, 13%, as far as I'm concerned, is a drop in the ocean, right? And there is this tension, between female founders who are starting their businesses and, ecosystems and funding ecosystems that don't necessarily fund them in completely fair ways. With regards to Nigeria specifically, and the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, my suspicion is that, I think, again, I don't have a crystal ball, right? So we'll wait and see. But my suspicion is that there are probably a couple of trends that suggest that it'll be harder for women. That suggests that number, that 13%, probably won't be 13% when we look at it again in 2020 for multiple reasons. I think one of the impacts of this, stepping outside of sort of the entrepreneurship and the tech space, I think one of the broad impacts of this pandemic has been the fact that a lot of women have found that they've had to double duty in a way that they do not normally have to do. They've had to be at home as well as continue with their professional lives. They've had to, of course, we're socially distancing. All of that has put pressure on the family, and we all know that women typically carry the broader burden of those kinds of things. The impact of that, of course, is that something has to give, and my suspicion is that when we look at the numbers again in 2020, we'll see that there has been some broad impact in terms of the activity of women within the ecosystem, which is a big shame. The good news is I expect that trend ultimately will reverse, and we'll start to go back towards having the levels that we have had in recent times. And then the job becomes, how do we get 13% to 50%? And I think that is a whole it's a complex set of considerations, but I would love to see much more fairer funding for female entrepreneurs in Nigeria, but across the world in general.
Mm.
Well, women have always had to do double duty, if you ask me.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Eloho, in your white paper analysis, you listed Nigeria amongst 40 countries who are underserved. How so?
Underserved, okay, I think you're referring to Endeavor focusing on what we call underserved ecosystems. Yeah. So underserved in terms of, we have 38 markets, and as context, Endeavor focuses on ecosystems that we consider to be underserved in terms of their capital access, for example, in terms of the access to global mentorship, for example. And the reason for that typically is because also, of course, we focus on ecosystems that are, emerging markets or frontier markets. And that means, of course, that, compared to some of the larger global hubs for capital, Silicon Valley being the obvious one, these ecosystems tend to be on the fringes. So part of what we're trying to do is, across these 38 markets that we're active in, is, as I've already alluded to, is to create these communities for those entrepreneurs and create bridges that allow them to access capital and talent and mentorship that they might otherwise not have access to because they're sitting outside of these traditional, more developed ecosystems that typically are better served by capital.
All right. Talk to us about the selection of 54Gene. We know they gained popularity and notoriety during this whole pandemic.
Right. And
they've actually shot up too. And they've been in people's faces. Talk to us about that particular selection and what does it mean to this whole stuff we've been speaking about.
Yeah, 54Gene. I mean, I'm excited about all of the companies that we have in our portfolio. As I referenced, there are 10 of them. 54Gene is the most recent company that we've selected in Nigeria. And it's led by founder CEO Abasi Eneobong. 54Gene is a healthcare company. The great thing is they're building a biodata bank of African genetic information that will allow them to contribute significantly to global pharmaceutical research and global pharmaceutical development. If you know a little bit about pharmaceuticals, the way that the products are developed really ultimately is you create the product based on the genetic data that you have, but then you test it on certain populations, right? What happens typically is a lot of the research doesn't happen in Nigeria. A lot of the product development doesn't happen. It happens outside of the continent, and a lot of the testing also happens outside of the continent. And so we get these products that and these medicines that effectively have relatively low efficacy for our own environments sometimes. The great news about 54Gene is that, of course, that they're trying to tackle that by providing biodata and a genetic bank for Africans. The other thing that I think is really exciting about this company is that they're providing access to the world's richest source of genetic data, which is African populations. there are many instances in which genetic data that has come from African populations has contributed significantly to frontier research that has benefited the entire world. So I'm super excited about this company for many reasons, including the fact that in terms of taking a seat at the table around our contribution to global genetic research, I think 54Gene is a company that will allow Africa to do that.
All right. Many thanks to you. By the way, 54Gene actually partnered with This Day Arise Group for the This Day Arise Group Isolation Center in Abuja. I want to say thank you to you very much, Eloho, for your time today.